All right, hello everybody. This week's lecture will be focusing on the late Joseon dynasty politics, particularly looking at political instability and the rise of in-law government at this time. So just to recap very briefly, political power was distributed during the Joseon dynasty according to this configuration. So we have the king and his officials, the Yangban, and the officials are divided into two sections. There are the civil officials and the military officials. And part of what the architects of the Confucian dynasty were trying to achieve was somewhat of a balance of power. Obviously, this balance would shift depending on the power and the abilities of the king or the power and abilities of his officials. So there was a bit of back and forth, but what did occur by the latter half of the Joseon dynasty was that we see the rise of some very powerful Yangban aristocratic families who were able to dominate the highest positions in the government. And part of this was possible because of the rise of in-law government. But when we think about how power is derived, part of this is also related to legitimacy. So power, there are many different forms of power. There could be military power, political power, economic power, social power. But when we look at the government, in particular the Joseon dynasty, we need to think about what is the criteria for legitimacy, because really if you are the king, for the most part it's the power and the legitimacy of the king that needs to be established. And if the king does not have that legitimacy, then there are questions over whether or not that king is fit to rule or the legitimate ruler. And the officials then can challenge the power of the king. So this inextricable relationship between power and legitimacy that often exists. And what we do see emerging then related to this is the rise of factional politics. So beginning about the 16th century, we see a debate and discussions over Neo-Confucian ideology. And there were several different factions or political groups that formed around ideas of what proper Confucian principles were. So just to give you an example, if, say, a king has his queen and several concubines, and one of the concubines dies, how long is it proper for the crown prince to mourn the death of a concubine if it is not his mother? So there's a lot of debate within the court over how long this mourning period should last. Should it last for 1 year? Should it last for 2 years? Should it go the full 3 years? That's standard for when a parent dies. And so there are these debates within the court, and people start to take sides around their opinions. And so what we see then is, depending on how the king rules or what kind of decisions the king makes in court, then now he has these supporters and opponents of him, and this is what gives rise to factional politics. Now, if a king behaves or makes decisions that the Confucian officials believe to be inappropriate, to be violating Confucian principles, then they can accuse the king of not being the proper or the legitimate ruler of the country. And so we have, the officials would never outright accuse the king of being an illegitimate ruler, but they can make these implications and nuances in other ways. And so we have, beginning in the 16th century, this factional politics that emerges. When Yangzhou comes to the throne in 1724, by this time, factional politics has really become severe, to the point where some factions not only have excluded other factions from political power, and now some factions are completely marginalized, but we do also have extreme cases where violence occurred. So when Yangzhou takes the throne in 1724, he enforces this policy of impartiality. So previous kings, they tended to favor one faction or another, and then would appoint members of that faction to important positions within the government. Yangzhou decides that he's not going to do this. So he's going to be impartial and neutral, and appoint officials from all different factions to important posts in the government. And because he did rule for such a long time, almost 50 years, or a little over 50 years, this policy was consistently in place. So we do see a settling down of the factional rivalries. And then following Yangzhou, we have Chengzhou. So Chengzhou comes to the throne when Yangzhou dies in 1776, and he rules for the rest of the century. He continues this policy of impartiality. And so during this century, during the 18th century, the throne and royal authority is really enhanced because we have two very strong kings who are on the throne. They are ruling for rather long periods of time, and because we have this strong kingly authority, the throne has become enhanced, and this implements some amount of control over the officials. Things do change, though, after Chengzhou dies. So when Chengzhou dies, there is a controversy over the death of Yangzhou's son. So Yangzhou's son was actually Chengzhou's father. And Yangzhou's son, he is a rather controversial figure in Korean history. The official records of the Joseon dynasty depict him as very immoral and unethical, and an improper king who did not care about his people. There have been several movies and Korean dramas, historical dramas, based on this character. And in those depictions of him, he's either portrayed as crazy, as this lunatic, or as just this king who just wants to party all the time. And so in any case, he's considered to be an improper, very immoral and un-Confucian king. And so the story is that Yangzhou, he had him put in a rice box, and he was just left there, and he eventually suffocated and died. So once Chengzhou dies, then this lingering controversy over the death of Yangzhou's son, whether or not this was proper or improper according to Neo-Confucian principles, that had been bubbling under the surface throughout Yangzhou and Chengzhou's reigns, and it comes to a head after Chengzhou dies. So this is evidence that although Yangzhou and Chengzhou, they implemented this policy of impartiality, it did not erase the source of factionalism. And so after Chengzhou dies, all of these factions, they go at it again, and they are at each other. So we see this continuing problem into the 19th century. Another problem that arises at the end, towards the latter half of the Joseon dynasty, is what is called in-law government. So what this is when a king dies, and he dies without an heir, or he dies and the heir is very young and comes to the throne when he's a child. Obviously, a child cannot rule a country, and so somebody has to make the political decisions. And usually that person who makes those decisions is the senior woman in the family. So the crown prince's mother or grandmother. So, or the newly installed king's mother and grandmother. And so we call this in-law government. And after Jeongjo dies in 1800, we have the beginning of a long era of in-law government throughout the 1800s. So Sunjo comes to the throne in 1800, and he is only 10 years old when he does become king. And his mother becomes the regent, the dowager regent, and she then starts to place her relatives in the government as officials. And so it's her family. This is why it's called in-law government. The in-laws family, they dominate the government and the power of the throne. So we have her relatives who are now controlling the government, and he reigns until 1834, and then is followed by Hunjong. So Hunjong is the grandson of Sunjo, the previous king, and his mother, she came from a different family. So whereas Sunjo's mother came from one family, the Andong Kim clan, the mother of Hunjong comes from the Pyongyang Cho clan. And so now you have the Kim clan and the Cho clan that are competing and fighting with each other. And so there is some of a shift, but the grandmother, who is of the Andong Kim clan, we have a power struggle, and the Cho clan, the Pyongyang Cho clan, are able to oust the Andong Kim, but Hunjong dies without an heir. So he's on the throne from 1834 to 1849, and he dies without an heir. So now we have a crisis of succession. So once he dies, the Queen Dowager rules for about a year, and she brings in Cheoljeong, the next king, Cheoljeong, who comes from kind of an obscure branch of the royal family, and she has him marry in a woman from the Andong Kim family, because she herself is from the Andong Kim family. So now we see yet another shift in power. So from the Pyongyang Cho family to back to the Andong Kim family. And again, the Andong Kim family, they place their people, their relatives in the government, and they pack the government again. But Cheoljeong also dies without an heir. So now we have yet another crisis succession. But by the time Cheoljeong dies, the senior woman is of the Pyongyang Cho clan, and so she chooses Gojong. So Gojong comes to the throne in 1864, and he is 12 years old when he assumes the throne. We have had, since 1800, a series of very young kings who have come to the throne and who have essentially been dominated by the mother's side of the family. So they they pack the government with their relatives in the highest positions of the government and are controlling the government in that way. So when Kojong comes to the throne in 1864, he's 12 years old. And the Andong Kim clan had essentially been in power except for briefly in the 1840s. And when the when the when Kojong came to the throne, his father, who is known as the Taewongun, he decides that he's going to end this in-law government. So what he decides to do is he decides to then take control of the government, and he starts making the political decisions. Now, by the time we get to the 1860s, we need to ask, so what is this pattern of royal power? We have these very young kings who are coming to the throne, and the mother's side of the family, their relatives are now controlling the government. Often this is done at the expense of the peasantry. So these relatives who are in power and they are taking advantage of their high positions and trying to amass even further wealth and status for themselves. So we have this very negative effect on the commoners because there's an increasing tax burden, there's widespread corruption, there's extortion, and the tax burden, it gets passed down to the peasants, and many of them, by the time we get to the 1860s, are being double taxed or taxed at an abnormally high rate. And then we also have to ask, what effects did this have on the bureaucracy and the Yangban? Because we have some of the Yangban who may have not picked the right side politically in these factional politics. Some are pushed out of power. Some, if you are not able to, in a Yangban family, if you're not able to continue to produce government officials, so your sons need to study for the civil service examination, pass the civil service examination, be placed in the government. If over generations a family is not able to do this, then eventually they get shut out of power. And if you don't have an official position in the government, that is your source of wealth and status. That's where you get most of your land and any salary and obviously your social status. So once that is then, once the family loses that, then the Yangban family also loses much more than a government position. So we begin to see these quote unquote fallen Yangban. These are those Yangban who have been excluded from government, and they have fallen to a status of kind of a local gentry. Some are even forced to become small-scale farmers, but their numbers increase. So during this time, by the latter half of the 1800s, we have the sharp upward and downward movements in social class. We will get to this a little bit more in later lectures, but for the time being, it's just important or sufficient to know that this is what occurred by the 1860s. And so as a result of this, we have widespread social discontent. This increase in corruption and high taxes and extortion, this becomes too much of a burden on the peasantry. So in the 1800s, there are widespread popular rebellions. And these popular rebellions, which are protests against the corruption and the high taxes, they begin to increase not only in frequency, but also in scale. So as I mentioned, we have characterizing the the later Joseon dynasty, this upward and downward social mobility, the loss of status by several Yangban families, and also the rise of other social classes, including the secondary status groups and some merchants. They are able to accumulate quite a significant amount of wealth, and some of them even begin to purchase Yangban aristocratic titles. If we look at the peasants and the slaves, so during this time there's a decrease in the number of slaves. Beginning in the 15th century, there are approximately 350,000 that were recorded as slaves. But by the time we get to the 17th century, there are about 200,000 that are recorded as slaves. Part of this is because of the destruction of slave records during the Hideyoshi invasions, and then a scattering of the slave population. But also there were some laws that were enacted. So for example, if you were a slave, but you fulfilled military service, you passed a military skills test, and 2 successive generations in your family performed military service, then you were able to be liberated from slavery. Some were able to simply purchase their own freedom. Some of them ran away during the chaos of the Hideyoshi and the Manchu invasions. But for all of these reasons, there is a decrease in the number of slaves, so that by 1801, the government decides to ban official slaves, and they burn their slave registers. There's also a corresponding increase in landless peasants, so peasants who are losing their land. A part of this is due to the increasing tax burden and increasing rents that are being imposed upon them. And then we have an increase in tenant farmers. So these are farmers who work the land that is owned by somebody else. And so all of these in combination then contribute to an overall rise in peasant uprisings. So by the time we get to the era of Gojong and the Daewongun looked at all of these problems that had occurred and decided that one of the first and foremost things that needed to be changed was to strengthen the kingship and to strengthen the finances. So the kingship, because of such a long period of in-law government, had really weakened. You have these small young boys who are coming to the throne at a young age and do not have any power, are controlled by the mother and the mother's family. It had really weakened the kingship. And so one of his main efforts was to strengthen the kingship. He reduced the power of the Andong Kim clan, and he tried to hire or to recruit officials who were men of talent instead of looking at their factional affiliation. He also found it very important to strengthen the finances. So he revised the tax system so that there would be more taxes levied onto the Yangban. This was obviously not well received. He converted the military cloth tax. So commoners, they were required to produce a certain amount of cloth that was to be used for the military. This was a kind of tax. And he converted that to a household tax that was to be assessed against the Yangban and commoners alike. And then also there were very many private Confucian academies, or seowon, and these private academies, they over time had royal patronage. They were acknowledged by the king and the government. They were given large tracts of land, large estates, and slaves, and all of this was tax-free. So they were exempt from tax and corvée or manual labor. But the Daewongun, when he came into the picture, he changed all of this and he started levying taxes. And he also started closing many of them down. So because they had all of this tax-free land and slaves, he confiscated a lot of that. So that by 1871, only 3 years after he really started coming down on the Confucian academies, he closed all except 47. And this then instigated quite a bit of bitterness from many Confucian scholars, those Confucian scholars who had been associated with these private academies. And then another thing that he did was he decided to rebuild the palace. So the main palace, Gyeongbok Palace, had been burned down during the Hideyoshi invasions and was never rebuilt. So when Gojong came to throne with the Daewongun in power, he decides to rebuild the palace, which is an extremely costly project. The Daewongun is also known for his isolation policies. So at this time, China had been, Western imperialist powers had slowly been making inroads into China. And by the late 1860s, China has already experienced the First Opium War and the Second Opium War, where unequal treaties have been imposed upon them. They've had to give up the territory of Hong Kong to the British. This is also coinciding with the opening of Japan. So Commodore Perry, an American, had sailed to Japan in 1853 and had forced open Japan and again had imposed an unequal treaty upon that country. And so the Daewongun had been looking at what was going on in China, looking at what is going on in Japan, seeing that these Western powers are belligerent and aggressive and unfair. And then along with this, because Japan had been opened up, now there's a lot more maritime traffic between China and Japan, but this means sometimes passing close to or through Korean waters. And so now we have an increasing appearance of foreign ships in Korean waters. The British, the French, the Russians, the Germans, the Americans, there's this increased traffic, and we see more and more of these foreign ships along the coast. And so the Daewongun was not open to allowing these foreigners to come in, and so although the Choson dynasty had always had an isolation policy, he further strengthened it during this time. The Daewongun was also known for being very anti-Catholic. Now, we'll go into more detail on this when we look at Christianity and Catholicism towards the end of the semester. But for now, suffice it to say that Catholicism was considered to be heterodox. It was seen to be something that undermined Confucian morality and Confucian ideology. And because of the close connection between Christianity and Western imperialism, the Daewongun saw Catholicism as a foreign threat to Korea. And so he decided to establish a very anti-Catholic policy in 1866. He declares that all Catholics must give up their religion, and he launches a full-scale persecution. At this time, 9 French missionaries were executed, and approximately 8,000 Korean converts were killed. But this is a part of his isolation policy and attempt to avoid dealing with the West. So how do we evaluate the Daewongun? Well, the Daewongun was extremely pragmatic. He was first and foremost interested in protecting the country, protecting the dynasty, and protecting the sovereignty of Choson. He wanted to restore the power and prestige of the throne, which had significantly declined in the 1800s. He wanted to increase control over the financial resources, and he also wanted to build up military strength. So these were undeniably all things that the Joseon dynasty needed to address at this time, and were problems that had come to a head for the Joseon dynasty. So the Taewongun was actually quite pragmatic in his policies in trying to protect and secure Joseon. However, there were institutional limits and obstacles. There's only so much that the Taewongun could do in order to address these issues. Part of this is because of the way that the government was structured. The government was structured to ensure a certain amount of balance of power. So throughout the Joseon dynasty, we don't see these dictatorial kings, these despots who come to power and are ruthless and completely control everything. Part of this is because that you have this very large, strong bureaucracy. And so the king and the bureaucracy, they act as checks on each other. The bureaucracy on the king and the king on the bureaucracy. Now, how did this work out? How was the bureaucracy able to check and limit the power of the king? Well, the Yangban, they were not really dependent on the king for their status and their position, because a lot of how they were able to gain their positions was based on inheritance of status and land ownership. The Yangban aristocracy, they monopolized education. So because the civil service examination was based on a classical Confucian learning, it's extremely difficult to study for the exams, and so they were able to monopolize education. Higher bureaucrats often recommended lower bureaucrats, and according to Confucian ideology, the king must conform to certain moral standards. So Confucian ideology itself limits the king from acting like a dictator. There is the right to remonstrate, which means that the officials have an institutional ability to criticize the king or to advise the king on alternate policies. There are also the royal lectures, so where the crown prince is tutored and educated in Confucian policy and education. The officials are also able to influence the crown prince in that way. And so there are certain checks on the king. Checks on the bureaucracy. Well, in converse, the king is also able to enforce a certain number of checks or limits on the bureaucracy. The king does have the right to appoint and dismiss officials. There's a certain amount of surveillance within the bureaucracy, so all officials are subject to evaluation by their superiors, and there at times were these secret censors who were sent by the king to investigate the performance of officials. This is particularly true when there were suspicions of an official acting in a very corrupt way. Then the king might send out a secret censor. There was punishment. The king was able to punish officials who were improper. You could punish them through torture, through exile, through execution, if if necessary. And then there are just basic Confucian standards, the stress of loyalty to the ruler, and then the idea that the rulers or ministers must support their king. So there were these institutional limits that were in place, and so because of this, the Daewongun was only able to implement reform up to a certain extent. And then if we also look at the historical factors leading up to the rule of the Daewongun and Gojong, if we look at what preceded this time period, we have the invasions, so both the Hideyoshi or the Imjin Wars and the Manchu invasions, and then following this, a long period of in-law rule. And so what both of these do is they contribute to a weakening of the strength of the kings. And so because by the end of the 19th century, then we have this historical precedent. The Daewongun, he identifies as one of the crucial areas to reform is the strengthening of the throne. All right. Now, if we look at just royal and central power in general over the course of the Joseon dynasty, royal and central power was relatively weak, although the government was centralized. It was relatively weak due to the long distances between Seoul or the capital and other areas of the country. So there was a matter of distance. There was also a matter of poor transportation. So we don't have a very well-developed system of roads and infrastructure at the time. And because Korea is 85% mountainous, it's very time-consuming to travel up and down these mountains. There's a time lag in the transmittal of communications. So from the central government to local governments, by the time that message gets to the local government, the situation could have entirely changed. And it was most important that district magistrates, so out in the provinces, that they fulfill certain tax quotas and maintain peace. If they did, if the local officials were able to do this, taxes were being sent to the capital or sent to the central government in a regular and timely manner, and that there were no uprisings or major problems to be reported, then the central government left the local officials pretty much alone. There was obviously wide variety from location to location, but and there was quite a bit of diversity. You know, the northern provinces their situation and their circumstances is very different from the southern provinces, but for the most place, they were left to administrate as they saw fit. And then if we look at bureaucratic power, we have, as I mentioned in the last lecture, the architects of the Joseon dynasty, they were very conscious about trying to disperse power so that power was not concentrated in one individual. And so we have this dispersal of power, and there's also, we have major decisions that are made by the government, major decisions made by large groups, often 30 to 50 officials who are debating and need to negotiate and agree on making a decision. There were struggles within the bureaucracy between older and younger officials, and there's competition. So a lot of competition amongst the officials as well. Violations of Confucian norms were noted and reported to higher authorities. Higher officials in general tended to identify with the throne because they had more access to the king and oftentimes had more influence over the king. They tended to identify more with the throne, whereas lower officials, they tended to criticize the higher officials, since it was a dangerous or a risky thing to directly criticize the throne. And so, as we've discussed, we had these factions within the government. This is also about a competition for power. So what we have then is really a lack of unity amongst the bureaucrats. And the bureaucrats never really assumed more power than the throne. And so this is what we have by the time Gojong comes to the throne and the Taewongun starts making all of the decisions. We have the lingering effects from the invasions, so widespread death and destruction, population movement, and a general and steady decline of the situation for the peasants and the farmers. And then we have a long period of in-law government, which weakens the throne. There's a history of these factional politics, which divides the bureaucracy. And then there's also a hardening of the isolation policy as the Taewongun sees what's happening to China and what's happening to Japan, decides that Korea doesn't need any of those kinds of problems. And so his solution is just to keep the Western powers out. So this is the situation. By the end of the 19th century, we will go on and compare this situation with what was going on with China and what was going on with Japan.